Firstly, I just want to begin by acknowledging that we're meeting on the lands of the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri peoples, on the unceded lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, and pay my respects to their elders past and present, and recognise their continuing connection to land, sea, culture and community. And I also pay my respects to, or extend my respect to all Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people who might be here with us today, either in person or online. And also for those who are online, some of you might be joining us from other parts of the country too. So I also just want to pay my respects and acknowledge the lands on which you might be joining us from. Also, people with lived experience are at the heart of everything that we do at the Mental Health Community Coalition, ACT. And I also want to recognise the vital contribution that they make at all levels and their contribution to better outcomes for everyone. So welcome to our end of year forum. For those who don't know me, I'm Corinne Dobson, the acting CEO for the Mental Health Community Coalition, ACT. So for those who haven't attended one of our 6 monthly forums before, this is one of our ways of giving back to the community managed mental health sector through a combination of learning, celebration and networking. So in this room and online, we have representatives from a wide range of organisations, including MHCC ACT members, non-members, government, as well as consumers and carers. And at each 6 monthly event, we focus on an issue affecting the sector. And today we're talking about stigma. We'll have a Q&A discussion panel featuring a stellar lineup of diverse speakers who each bring their own unique insights to this topic. And after that, we'll take some time to celebrate the sector's achievements over the past month, and there'll be an opportunity for people to talk and network over some afternoon tea. So today's topic, perspectives of stigma, diversity and community. We chose this as a topic, and I must give credit to Ben for coming up with the idea and assembling the speakers. We chose it as is an issue that remains so pervasive and has such a profound effect on the lives of people with lived experience, and not just amongst people with mental ill health, but also people who don't fit the mainstream in whatever way. It's often noted that people in Australia today know much more about mental illness than previous generations. We're more likely to understand that most of us will experience some form of mental ill health in our lifetime. We often hear celebrities and other public figures disclose their own mental health challenges. And the pandemic has certainly brought to the fore in the public discussions issues around mental health and wellbeing. And yet, despite all of that, stigma persists. As the well-known peer worker and mental health advocate Tim Heffernan powerfully said, stigma continues to be a persistent dry wind that strips us of our humanity. So the purpose of today's forum is to explore stigma in all its various dimensions and diverse effects, from an intersectional perspective, in terms of different types of stigma, and why stigma remains so pervasive despite all those factors that I just mentioned. And we also want to consider what might work to try and tackle and reduce stigma, whether current anti-stigma approaches are actually working, and what other solutions or options we might need to take up to combat stigma in all its forms. So there are volumes of research demonstrating both the ubiquity of mental health stigma in Australia and the negative impact that it has on personal recovery related to mental health challenges. The National Survey of Mental Health Related Stigma and Discrimination, commissioned by the National Mental Health Commission and released last month, estimated that over 4 million people in Australia had experienced mental health related stigma and discrimination in the past 12 months. So that was a survey of nearly 8,000 people in Australia. And it found as I said, that stigma was common, but also that it disproportionately affected women, young people, and LGBTIQ+. Sadly, the most common form of stigma was from people identified was from those who were close to them. 1 in 3 people with recent personal lived experience of mental health conditions reported unfair treatment by family and friends, and 1 in 4 said they had experienced unfair treatment by their spouse or partner. Experiences of discrimination in the workplace were also common, with 1 in 3 people reporting unfair treatment in the workplace. And the survey also found that the levels of discrimination vary significantly depending on the types of mental health condition or mental illness, with those experiencing more complex issues like schizophrenia being disproportionately impacted. And of course, the consequences of this stigma and associated discrimination can be far-reaching. So the national survey found people who had experienced mental health related discrimination were more than twice as likely to avoid accessing healthcare because of how they anticipated people might respond to their mental health problem. So I think it was around, I don't have it written down here, but I think it was around 2/3 said that they had experienced discrimination in general practice. They were also 3 times more likely to have decided not to apply for employment opportunities. And there is a whole lot of statistics in that report. And I'm not going to go through them all because I think you'll probably be overwhelmed with them, but they are certainly very stark and sobering, and I think really serve to highlight why today's topic that we're talking about is such an important one and one that we really need to confront. So as well as highlighting, you know, just how pervasive stigma is and the impact it has, there are also different types of stigma. And alongside the survey that I mentioned, the National Mental Health Commission released a draft National Stigma and Discrimination Reduction Strategy. And this is open for public consultation and feedback until I think it's February next year. So in that strategy, they've identified 3 different forms of stigma. And of course, people can identify others and might contest the way that they've divided that up, but these are the 3 forms that they identified in the draft strategy. So there's public stigma, structural stigma, and self-stigma. And so as it's defined in the draft strategy, public stigma is negative thoughts, feelings, and behaviours held or expressed by individuals towards people who experience mental ill health. Structural stigma occurs when laws, policies, and practices enable unfair treatment of people who experience mental ill health. So that can make it harder for people with mental ill health to also access vital services and to participate in society. And self-stigma occurs when a person with lived experience becomes aware of public stigma, agrees with those stereotypes, and internalizes them by applying them to themselves. That's the definition in the draft national strategy. We also need to acknowledge, of course, that stigma doesn't work alone or in isolation. So just as having a mental health condition can result in experiences of stigma and discrimination, discrimination experienced by marginalised and diverse communities can also contribute to mental ill health. And it can also have a compounding and reinforcing effect on the discrimination that people might, or the stigma that people might experience due to their mental ill health. Racism, sexism, homophobia, and other discriminatory views and behaviours that marginalised communities have been shown to increase the likelihood of experiencing mental health challenges, to worsen existing mental health conditions, and to decrease the likelihood of seeking help. Different forms of marginalisation and stigma can be, as I said, mutually reinforcing and compounding. And sadly, discrimination in many different forms is still very widespread in Australia. So I think a lot of statistics here about these various different forms of discrimination. As I said, I don't want to bombard you with too many different statistics, but what it really shows is that stigma is unfortunately far too common, and really disproportionately affects a number of groups. We see that it's significantly higher for LGBTIA+ people and people living with disability. People from I think the ABC survey last year found that 3/4 of non-Anglo respondents had experienced discrimination. And of course, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples experience discrimination at much, much higher rates. I think the latest Reconciliation Australia Barometer found that it was over half. And younger people also are more likely to experience discrimination. And all of these groups are also more likely and we saw that in the National Study of Mental Health and Wellbeing, to experience poorer mental health outcomes. So I think that all highlights why today's topic is so important and why we need to also be approaching discussions on stigma and discrimination from an intersectional perspective. And to enable that, today we have assembled a diverse range of speakers on our panel to explore that complex issue. However, just before our panelists begin and are introduced, I just want to call to the front Ben Matthews, our Sector Development Officer, to set some principles for today's discussion. And this will be based on MHCC's Do No Harm framework. Thanks, Ben.
Thank you everyone for coming. We're going to run through some principles developed by MHCC, and actually I'm going to play a little game here. Anyone that's ever worked for or volunteered for MHCC, put up your hand. So thank you very much. And Keith will have something to say about MHCC's work and stigma as well. But welcome to all the MHCC people. It's wonderful that you came. So I won't go through these in particular order. I'll just sort of talk to the topic in a broader sense sort of thing. And so what the Do No Harm framework and process is learning to think about how you ask questions, how you talk about your story, how you share your story, how you talk to people about your lived experience. And so this topic today might actually have some triggering content for some people. And in case that happens, we have the wonderful Kate up the back, and Kate is a mental health peer worker from Stride, and she works as a peer worker at the Safe Haven Cafe in Belconnen. And so if you want to have a yarn or you feel a little bit emotional, Kate's there to support you. But really it's about thinking about how you ask questions here. You know, if we're talking about eating disorders, suicidal thoughts, self-harm, we don't talk about methods or details of those sorts of issues. We really try and focus on the feelings around the issues and, you know, avoid those sort of war stories, if you want, so to speak. So that's sort of really what I want to impress, is just remembering that we don't know people's trauma, we don't know what their experiences are. So just be really mindful of that sort of process when you're thinking about the questions you ask. So thank you very much, and thank you to MHCC. And I'm actually going to embarrass Pam Boyer because she was one of the most instrumental people in the development of the Do No Harm process. So thank you, everyone. And I'll go back to Corinne.
Thanks, Ben. So to start us off, I want to introduce our panel facilitator, Keith Marr, who I'm sure, as Ben said, many of you will know. Keith is a social worker who has worked in recovery-oriented mental health programs in Canberra since 2009. As a mental health advocate, Keith has been involved in local, national and international initiatives addressing mental illness stigma. He has publicly shared his lived experience of severe mental illness in Canada and recovery in Australia to try and challenge stigma, encourage others to seek help and to inspire hope. Keith is a former volunteer, educator and president at Mental Illness Education ACT, and his story is included in the book Coming Out Proud to Erase the Stigma of Mental Illness. Please welcome Keith.
So just to set the record straight, recovery doesn't mean a lack of anxiety. So we're just going to get into this. And also, how are we going to do the for the panelists when they're talking? Does everyone just come up, and when they're taking questions, will we have a mic that comes to the table, or? Okay, great. So we're going to introduce people in alphabetical order by their name. Now, these names go from A to Z, so we have a wide range of both names, and so we're not. This is how we've selected who we're going to talk to first. Also, Ben has mentioned that everyone gets 3 minutes, every panelist, and then I don't know if you know that Ben has a really good internal clock, and if that clock goes to 3 minutes, he's going to raise his hand just like that, Big Ben, and then we'll know that it's time to wind up the 3 minutes. And also, we've been asked that when someone's asking a question from the floor, if you could really be succinct about the question. I know that, you know, stigma raises there's a lot of passionate people, but it's about getting to the question, just like on Q&A. I guess they'll just get to the question as soon as possible. So thank you. The first person on our panel I want to introduce is Alistair Ott. Alistair is a Wiradjuri non-binary queer brother boy living and working on Ngunnawal land. Alistair, living with chronic health and mental health conditions and also being neurodivergent, Alistair is passionate about supporting and advocating for his intersecting communities. They currently work as the engagement coordinator at Agenda, a transgender, gender diverse, and intersex community organization. So thank you very much for coming, Alistair. Judy Bentley. And you'll notice that Judy Bentley is going to be modeling the AMD P2 mask, which I endorse for COVID. So if you ever want a really good mask, Judy has the bomb. Judy is a compassionate activist for improved services and conditions for carers, families, and consumers. She has extensive experience as an advocate and care representative at national and local levels, and is currently serving a second term as member on the Ministerial Mental Health Advisory Council. She's also represented on the National Mental Health Consumer and Care Forum, the Collaborative Engagement Forum, and the Expert Reference Group in the development of partners in recovery. Judy was an active proponent in the development of MHCC ACT and deputy chair for its first 4 years. She has held board positions with Lived Experience Australia and the Richmond Fellowship, and is a member of the National Register of Mental Health Consumer and Carers. That's Judy. Now Sharon is behind me on the screen, who I met in person at the Grace Groom oration just the other week. Sharon is the chair and executive director of Lived Experience Australia, a nationally awarded mental health consumer and care advocacy organization. She's also a professor at Flinders University and undertakes a broad range of mental health research from a lived experience perspective. Sharon is particularly passionate about addressing physical and mental health comorbidity, stigma, and coercion in care, and exploring the person's and their families' experiences of seeking and receiving support within healthcare systems. So welcome. Terry Warner in the middle. So Terry has fans in the audience, and Terry is a mental health advocate, educator, and researcher with 15 years of experience working in the ACT mental health sector in policy, governance, education, and training roles. Her experiences of trauma, distress, neurodivergence, chronic health conditions, and mental health and social care services inform all her work. Terry's a SANE Australia peer ambassador and member of the National Register of Mental Health Consumer and Care Representatives, and was on the National Stigma Report Card Steering Committee. She's been published and presented internationally and is presently undertaking her PhD at the ANU Medical School. That's Terry. Now, last but not least, Zakia Patel. As regional manager, director of the Multicultural Hub Canberra, Zakia is a leader with passion for using her skills to support marginalized communities and particularly young people. She has over a decade of experience working in the community sector and holds a Bachelor of Law in Economics. Zakia has volunteered with the New South Wales State Emergency Service, SES, for almost 14 years as a unit commander for the Queanbeyan SES unit with over 100 volunteers. If there's an emergency, we are following Zakia out that door. She's passionate about encouraging and empowering migrant women to volunteer in predominantly male-dominated industry. So there we have it, the panel that will be answering the questions. So could we have a round of applause for I guess let's just go in that same order, A to Z. I'm sorry, Zakia, I'm really sorry. We'll reverse things afterwards, but let's go through with Alistair coming up. Did you want to speak? Oh, just grab. Does this work? Just grab it. Fighting with it now. Okay.
Thank you. All right. Hopefully this works. I've got a timer here because I'm anxious about that. I don't want to see Ben look at me disappointed because I've gone over time. So thank you so much for introducing me. It's quite interesting to hear and to write all my life experience in a few words. And I always struggle with that when it's like, okay, yes, I'm a Wiradjuri, queer, trans, non-binary, and I'm trying to figure out how to put it all together. And that's not how identity works. Of course, it's not a hierarchy of who I am on a page. In the primary identity for me, my primary self is being Aboriginal and being mob, being a black fella. And that's always been very important to me. And I think that's where everything kind of started from, because I grew up with mob, grew up with my family, grew up with my kin, and then everything else happened. You know, I had the gender issues. I had, issues trying to figure out who I was, the confusion, and there was a lot of shame wrapped around it as well, especially because it just wasn't talked about. And I'm quite young. I'm only 24, turning 25 in a couple months. But even looking back now as a support worker, looking back on how I grew up, the amount of knowledge and information there was out there was very little. And I had no idea what identity I had no idea the terms and the information, the language to use. So I always say a lot of my childhood was wrapped in this shame, and trying to figure out what I was informed by that shame. And I think now for me it is looking outside of that and trying to escape that box of shame and that box of looking at my identities from a negative standpoint and from this these negative experiences that I have had externally, but now looking at an internal positive connections and the euphoria that I feel. So yes, I'm Wiradjuri. I am non-binary and trans, and for me that means that I have a trans experience. I have kind of transitioned, if you'd like to say that, but I'm non-binary, and that's what that means to me. And it means that I have experienced very different levels of marginalization, discrimination, harassment. It means that I never go out in public. Yeah, I never go out in public without experiencing some form of harassment, which is why now as a support worker, that's why I do it. It's because I have been so supported by the community. I've been so supported by the mental health organizations as a young person that now I can actually do something with that as a support person. That's really where it comes from. I've got about 20 seconds left. So I'll just say I'm really happy to be here and have a yarn. I really want to wait to there we go, about 10 seconds left. Yeah, I'll wrap up there. Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Ben. God almighty.
I think it's a compliment.
Right. I think it's the confusion. Actually, I'm very lucky. I sort of think, well, I haven't really experienced that terrible discrimination. I'm white, I'm reasonably well educated and articulate, and I can stand up for myself. But the terrible thing, I think, is when I go to an appointment with my GP, I don't have any problems. I'm seen, I'm listened to, my problems are recognised. And I think the difference when I have seen what's happened to my son, who is a young adult and has a severe and persistent mental illness, and he goes to the GP, he's been banned from the practice. He was in the middle of a psychotic episode. If he'd been in the middle of a heart attack, he would have been treated, but he was asked to leave. And I think there was no understanding. This is a large practice. It's one he's been associated with for a long time. So it's that sort of, I sort of think, now what is the difference between stigma and discrimination? And I think stigma comes first and the discrimination comes afterwards. And it's awful, but I feel as if I'm not an expert in this subject, but it breaks my heart to see what's happened to my son. And this is continued. He's had problems with the judicial system and the discrimination there, to have been told by a magistrate in Queanbeyan that I'm sick of you young men coming in and saying that you issues were caused by your mental illness, and threatened with him being sent to Goulburn prison. And that's something I can't get over either. So I suppose for a carer, looking at somebody you really love, you've nurtured, you've given birth to, and then to see what's happened to their lives, the lives that he hasn't been, he's in his early 40s, and his life is not fulfilled. He's got a degree through Partners in Recovery, my favourite thing, I've got to throw that in, where he had a marvellous facilitator. Have I gone over Ben already? And I think he needs that support. He needs that facilitator to walk alongside of him. He's got honours and distinctions with his university studies, but he can't get employment. And again, I think that is that, not so much stigma, it's discrimination. Doesn't happen to you if you've got a broken leg or a broken heart. So I'm passionately sort of in favour of support for him and for carers.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Now we're going to rely upon technology and go to Sharon. Hopefully everything goes to plan.
Great, thanks. Can everyone hear me okay? Great. Hi everyone, I'm Sharon Lawn. I've been a lived experience researcher of sorts for about 20 years at Flinders Uni, and I've always had a strong focus on elevating the person's voice in the narrative, very intentionally, and always really interested in the systems, how people treat each other in those systems, how they behave towards each other, particularly how mental health professionals act in institutions and systems where they might otherwise act differently, completely differently in their personal lives, and what the consequences are for people who use or find themselves in those systems. So the stigma and discrimination issue is pretty fundamental to all of that. So when I did my PhD a long time ago, it was an ethnography, which is basically living in, spending time in, observing the culture of smoking within mental health settings. And that was an incredible experience. I've also looked a lot at the power relationships within care planning and the experiences of people who are subject to CTOs, particularly the conundrum of you deliver coercive care when you're also delivering care. And I think stigma and discrimination have some fundamentals in there. But these days, much of my research is focused on exploring veteran suicide, veteran identity and abuse issues in the military, and issues around transition from the military and their consequences, particularly for veterans broadly, but also women veterans. As you can probably gather, research and advocacy are one thing for me, because research is evidence and evidence becomes a powerful tool for advocacy. But so long as the voices of people most impacted are actually front and centre and understood. So our most recent lived experience project has been on the experience of loneliness, and stigma came up as a really prominent enmeshed part of that experience. I'm really interested in the underpinning structures that seem to perpetuate stigma and discrimination. For example, the potential for unintended consequences and this fascination with people that they don't even realise when they're being discriminatory and stigmatising. And I'll give you a couple of examples in a minute. So in a world where we seem to celebrate diversity and the wonder of difference, what is it that we're missing about difference that keeps stigma going is a question I ask myself. What are the potential double standards or distortion of the rules that seem to keep us stuck, to not be fully open to diversity and difference and lifelong learning, rather than you know, we seem to retreat to the limits of, you know, cultural and social rules and expectations and definitions about what we should this and we should that. So that's of interest in all this. But a couple of examples that really stick out for me around this issue are, you know, in my life, I identify as having direct lived experience, but also as a family carer. And a very long time ago, a very cheeky consumer advocate called Wayne, in a presentation at Thames one year, asked me, after I'd presented on family's experience, asked me, why do you stay in the relationship? Why do you stay? And I said, because I love the man. And he, you know, he deliberately prompted the question, but I wonder, you know, why is it that some people would just see, yeah, they didn't see the person, they just saw the situation of illness. And the other example is when my husband was in hospital, and at that point I was actually working in a mental health system. And one of my colleagues came up to me and said, oh, I just don't know how you do it, Sharon. And it, like, so these examples of backhanded stigma and discrimination, and it floored me at the time. And then 2 minutes later, which is what happens after you can't find the words, you find the words and you think, they just don't get it. You know, this is my family. Yeah, so they're my early thoughts, and I'll hand back over to you for the next person on the panel.
Thank you very much, Sharon. Thank you. Yeah. And I have a great memory, so now I just
So I began my career in the mental health sector as a lived experience storyteller, working in programs that were focused on stigma reduction through community education. And one of the ways that we talked about stigma in those programs was as a mark of shame. And we explained that some people are stigmatized because they have characteristics or behaviors that other people perceive negatively. Now, the longer that I spent thinking about that, the more I realized that it puts the shoe on the wrong foot. So I'm not stigmatized because of characteristics that I have or ways that I behave. I'm stigmatized because other people develop negative attitudes and perceptions about people who have certain characteristics or behaviors, often characteristics or behaviors that mean they don't or can't conform to a broadly accepted but largely unexamined set of homogenizing social rules. So for me, stigma is a much broader and more complex problem than this idea that some people accept that negative stereotypes are true and treat other people badly because they have a characteristic that corresponds to that stereotype. And now as a researcher, two of the key questions that I am always asking are, what exactly is happening here and what makes it possible for this thing to be happening? So that means I look in depth at history and at social and cultural systems and at the ways in which we construct our ideas about the world and the people in it. And as someone who's had the experiences I've had, that can be a very degrading and painful process at the same time as it can be a very validating and healing one. Now, one of the things that I always have to remind myself, both personally and professionally, when I'm thinking about stigma towards people who experience mental health challenges, is that I and a lot of people, certainly over the age of 35 and probably even younger, we were born into a world where these attitudes and these perspectives are endemic, but we weren't necessarily born into a world where anyone assumed that those stigmas would ever apply to us. So I have to admit that for a long time, I bought it, I ate it, and it's really only in the last 20 years or so, so the last second half of my life, that I've made an active choice to stop swallowing it. And that means that I hold a lot of grief and shame and rage about how those attitudes and perspectives have shaped the way that I see myself and my place in the world. So these days, when I share my experiences, it's not to reduce stigma, it's to confront it. Because these negative perceptions and attitudes exist in the world at varying levels of intensity, but they shouldn't change the way that we feel about ourselves or how we shape who we are. And they also shouldn't shape the way that we see broad groups of people who have a characteristic that sets them apart from other people who just happen to construct themselves as normal.
Now, in my own experience, perseverance is one of the keys to mental health recovery and evolution. And so this is an example. You've waited till the end. You've been very perseverant. So here we go. And Zakia, there you go.
I'm okay to go last because I'm used to it, because my parents named myself and all my siblings Zeds, as they do. But it also gave me time to think about what I wanted to say. So I guess thank you for the introduction before when you were reading out the bios. And one of the things that I realized that's missing from mine is my cultural identity. So I'm a very proud Fijian, Indian, Australian. I was born in Fiji, but I've lived pretty much my whole life from the age of 4 in Australia. And I really think about this a lot. And I realized that the reason I don't include it or haven't included it is because it was something that I always hid growing up in Australia. And I guess that was one of my biggest challenges, was really working through my cultural identity as a child. It's really difficult to understand. You know, you look different, but you're learning the same culture and the same education systems and everything around, you know, with your peers, but you know you're different, and you know you're different because people are telling you you're different. So along with the cultural identity issues, there was a lot of racism that I experienced. And I apologize if I sound a little bit emotional, but it gets to me every time. And I only really accepted my cultural identities, and not just accepted, but wanted to share it with people when I actually came into the work role that I am now, because I was suddenly surrounded by people that looked like me, that dressed similar to some of my cultures, that spoke the same language as me, because I do speak different languages, but shared similar experiences. And I think that was probably the most pivotal moment in my life. And it took 30 years to get to that point where I could go, okay, I feel really comfortable in who I am. I think it's also those experiences that really help motivate and drive my passion in my work role, working with multicultural communities to address stigma and cultural barriers and norms, to addressing mental health. And it was a really big part of why we, in 2020 and 2021 in my organisation, launched our multicultural counselling service, because we realised that we needed a service that was culturally appropriate to work with our multicultural communities around mental health and really address the stigmas. And there is a lot, and I'm sure we'll get into it as we go along. But you know, for me, being here is really special to be able to share some of that with everyone that's here today, you know, and really kind of understanding really the basics of what exists in multicultural communities around addressing mental health, but also from a personal experience, you know, being able to share some of those experiences as well. So thank you.
And I think the change in stigma and change in attitudes, I think everyone was a little bit shy to begin with. And so I actually think that we owe Alistair a clap as well, because everyone started getting into clapping mode. But I want to give Alistair a clap because everyone is a little bit hesitant at the beginning. But thank you. Now, are there questions from Rose? Okay, we'll get a roving mic. Can we get a? Okay, great. So, is there? Just like.
Thank you. I've known Terry for quite a few years, and Terry really inspires me and everyone else I know. And I love about Terry is that she's humble about that, and she knows her true standing and stands up for like a warrior. But she supports those that are vulnerable, that can't speak up for themselves in an excellent way. So my question for her today is, Terry, I would like to ask you today about your psychosocial disability and your research. So can you give us just a basic explanation so that we know what you're up to, please?
Just going to drag the mic cord across everyone to answer this question. Thank you so much, Rose. And this is actually really quite relevant because the work that I've been doing is looking at how the NDIS has shaped the way we understand psychosocial disability and what that has meant for the lives of the people affected. And one of the things that I've been doing is actually asking people, do you think other people's attitudes towards someone with psychosocial disability are different than they would be towards someone who said, oh, I have a mental health condition? And I've been getting some really interesting answers. So in some cases, people have said, actually, I think you're probably better off saying you have a psychosocial disability, largely because people don't really know what it means. So you avoid a lot of those problematic stereotypes and those sort of assumptions people have about particular diagnoses. But on the other hand, some people say, well, the problem with the idea of psychosocial disability is that people might assume a level of competence or a level of functioning that is different to what they might assume if you were to say, I have this particular mental health condition. So you're kind of damned either way. Someone will find some way to marginalize and stigmatize you based on that particular characteristic. But what's going to be interesting is to see how that actually plays out as more people claim the identity of psychosocial disability as distinct from being placed into a policy category group for eligibility for social programs. So thank you so much for that question, Rose. It was really fantastic.
Any other brave soul? Rose's story. I think I see a gentleman down there in a green shirt.
Thank you very much. I'll just share very briefly, a bit of lived experience in the context. I was quite fascinated with the survey when it said that the highest proportion of stigma actually came from family and loved ones. And that was about a third. It was a really big chunk. And as Corinne said, the survey was somewhat sobering, but I didn't find it sobering. I just wanted to get a bottle of vodka, really. It was very, very damning in some ways. But for my experience, that's actually true. I've been felt stigmatized in hospitals. Not a lot of public stigma, lots of self-stigma. And most of the stigma I've experienced has actually come from my family, my broad family, my brother, my brothers and sisters, especially my children. And I sort of thought I'd ask Judy about this and perhaps Alistair as well, because I don't think it's all that simple, because it just gets bloody hard for families. It gets so hard, and sometimes they just give up on it. And it's not just stigma. It's not that simple. You know, my children have been traumatized by my trauma. And so, you know, that generational stigma and that generational trauma just keeps happening and happening. And so I was just curious as to what you think about the depth of that sort of statistic where we say, well, the survey says that, you know, the majority of stigma comes from family. But I think there's more to it. It just gets too hard for family at times.
I find it shattering. To me, it was like a kick in the teeth in many ways. There's that self-stigma, I suppose, that I accept. What did I do? Why couldn't I have protected my son? Why didn't I keep him safe? Am I a bad mother? So there has always been that stigma that I accept. And I don't know quite how to deal with that. But my son has certainly, it's been a difficult 22 years. It's been appalling. It's led to family breakdown, marriage breakdown, sort of lots and lots of issues. But his two brothers love him to bits. I love him to bits. His dad loves him to bits. He's accepted the daughters-in-law. The other two daughters-in-law have some problems. They perhaps were a little bit fearful in the beginning, but not now. Yeah, I found that an awful statistic to accept because it's not in my experience. But I don't disbelieve that it happens, but it's no more his fault that he got a mental illness than another child I had who had leukemia. And no one ever blamed him for, blamed my daughter for having leukemia, but Justin has had blame heaped on him, lack of understanding, even to friends, you know, good family friends who said, I wish I could do something to help. And I said, well, perhaps if you took him out for a cup of coffee and just talked. And he said, oh, well, I wouldn't know what to say. And I thought, well, just, yeah, it's really hard. It's hard for people to accept mental illness. We don't do that with physical illnesses, but I don't know whether I'll live long enough to see that change.
Yeah, no, we're right. It's good. We'll just keep it going. Yeah, it doesn't surprise me at all. I think there's absolutely a disconnect, and I hear it with the clients I work with my friends, my family, my found family. What we hear is parents and family say, well, it couldn't be you. They'll be accepting for everyone else. They'll be accepting for their queer friends. They'll be accepting for other people. But then when it's their own child, they're like, no, you've done something wrong. Or actually, you don't know what you're talking about. There's this complete lack of acceptance, and we see that in like the statistics of young queer folk who are homeless or experience homelessness, and I've experienced it 2 times in my life now at different stages. I've been very lucky. I've got a really great immediate family, but I have received a lot of stigma from extended family because I think there's that disconnect. They just don't believe it could happen to someone they know. And there's also just a lack of education and understanding. And I mean, a lack of education, it breeds hate, because when you don't understand it, you're fearful of it. And I see it being both like queer and trans, but also with disability and experiencing mental illness throughout my life. I do see that there's just, it really comes back to never realizing it could happen to someone you know. And then when it does, you haven't prepared for what to do about it. So you don't know where to put your time and energy and love. And that can always end up, unfortunately, with negative experiences for everyone involved. Does either?
I think we'll go to Sharon and then get a question first. So Sharon, do you have any research around family stigma or potential reasons why there might be such a profound impact on of stigma?
Yeah, I think you know, the research I've done with families, people with mental health challenges, but also specifically the veterans and first responders as well. You know, like families are very diverse things. They come with histories long before mental illness comes along as well. So not every family is the same, and some families just don't get along anyway. And I think mental health issues accentuate things in families. And behind that, system failures then accentuate the stresses on families. And some families resort to the bottom line, and that, you know, that awful word gaslighting, which you see in some families where, you know, people are under stress, systems are failing, poor education perhaps, other things come into the mix, and it's all too hard for families. So the person becomes the object in that situation, and families rail against it. A lot of the, you know, in the research I've done, you know, many, particularly with partners, they're railing against it. They're railing against the, you know, that ever-present pressure to gaslight the person. You know, hopefully I'm not offending people by that awful word, because they just want a relationship. They want a quality of life relationship where there isn't this stigma, discrimination, but all around them, families, you know, they might help the person get to appointments and things, and every health professional they'll come across, if they're in the room, the health professional will talk to the family and not even look at the person. So they're getting all this reinforcement all the time that the person is somehow less, that the person can't speak for themselves, or that even if they need a bit of help with things, that's all okay. You know, there's all this stuff going on for families. So it's not just about what happens in families, it's what happens in the whole context of families.
Great, thank you. I guess, you know, I guess it could be that families have the most invested, the biggest investment in the people they love the most. And so maybe they also, you know, knew people before they become unwell. So it's harder for them to accept that you know, that the person is not the person that they, you know, acting or you know, maintaining the relationships they had in the past. I don't know. But I thank you very much for all your comments.
Just a comment, when systems fail, families bear the consequences.
That's right. Yeah.
So, you know, that's what pushes them to that line. Yeah.
Yeah, they have the biggest at stake. I have a question for Zakia. We're going to go for. I'm going to bypass you just for 1 second because I want to get to Zakia over here. I'm just wondering, how does mental health stigma interact with and reinforce other forms of stigma, such as those based on ethnicity?
That's a really good question. And to answer that, I think it's got to go to the very basics of language. So language, in many multicultural communities, there's actually no word for mental health. So if I think about my own language, and if I was to try and translate mental health, mental illness, the literal translation into English would be crazy. So I think that gives a really good insight into how mental health is seen in communities. And it kind of, I think, links a little bit into Ben's questions, is that within culturally diverse communities is at the forefront. So families and communities go hand in hand together. There's sometimes no differentiation. I might not be related to people in my community, but they're my uncles, they're my aunts, they're my grandparents, and I label them that way. So to go hand in hand with that, there's a lot of shame and embarrassment. So people don't address mental health, one, because they actually don't know what it is. They don't know how to label it. They don't know what to call it. They don't know how to speak about it because there's no words to use to be able to have those discussions. And then you're thinking about, you know, the shame and embarrassment because community talks. We don't want people to know in our community what we're going through. It's the same thing we see with domestic and family violence. People don't want to talk about it because of the shame and embarrassment that exists around addressing it. And people don't want people to know their business, and communities talk. So that's a really big part of, I think, how mental health is seen in communities. And I actually think about my experiences. So I have a cousin who is diagnosed as bipolar and had some really horrific experiences growing up. And we happened to be in Fiji when this was happening, and the first time she experienced psychosis. And I was maybe 8 years old. And the first thing that I remember the adults in our household saying was, do not tell anyone about this. They didn't treat it as mental illness. They didn't take her to the hospital. They actually didn't get her help. And I feel really embarrassed saying this, it's my family, but they locked her in a room and just said she'll come out of this. And there was a lot of talks around, you know, black magic and things like this. And so when I was in my teenage years and really struggling with, you know, cultural identity issues and the mental health effects of that, I didn't want to talk about it because I'm thinking, well, am I going to get locked in a room? Not that my parents would do that. And my parents were actually wonderful in helping me overcome a lot of this, but it was a friend who saw what I was going through that actually spoke to my parents and said, I think you need to talk to Zakia. And that's how it was addressed in my household, because I didn't want to talk about it because of what I was seeing. So when we work with communities, the first thing that we try and do, and I have these conversations a lot with people, is think about how you're going to explain mental health to that person that you're working with. Because if you sit down and say those words to them, like, I think you might need some counselling support or some mental health support, they're going to look at you and go, no. What does that mean? What are you talking about? You know, people who grow up here, I think we're in a bit of a stage at the moment where we've got a lot of young people from multicultural backgrounds who are now breaking away from those stigmas and norms and probably changing within their communities a lot of the ways that they interact with mental health and mental illness with their younger people. But we're talking about adults who are then having to support them through that process, who don't understand what it is, have significant language barriers. If they're sitting across from a doctor who's trying to explain to them, look, I think your child might need to go into mental health plan, or we need to connect them with Headspace or services that can support them, they're probably going to go, nope, I don't know what you're talking about. And it just comes down to that. So I think when we talk about multicultural communities, we have to go right back to the basics of explain to them actually what we're talking about first to help them understand it.
I was actually just going to jump onto Ben's question about family stigma. When I came out as a gay man 20 odd years ago, my dad was the hardest one in my family that I had to deal with. And whilst he wasn't resentful, he wasn't aggressive. It was just something that was a very difficult conversation to have. But when I came to sit down with him and say, you know, this is just who I am, he said, that's fine. How long have you taken to get to this position? And I said, oh, it's been a few years. I've been mulling it over. And he said, you got to realize that I've had 32 years of hopes and dreams for you. And now you've just dashed them all. That takes some time for me to accept. So you've taken a few years to accept where you're at. Don't expect me to turn up on the dime where you're at. Okay, good point. So from other perspectives, whether it's mental health, whether it's, whether it's coming out as trans, whatever the case may be, the family has an expectation of what you are and what you'll do and where you'll go. And we go and break that mold or break that track. So that may be something we need to take into consideration when we're talking with family, that it's not just our perspective. That's what they've thought and what they've hoped for, you know, going forward.
And so do you have a question that on that pathway in terms of, you know?
No, it was just, I just wanted to jump that back onto Ben.
Well, I guess I'm wondering about do you have strategies in terms of how to talk to the people that love you the most and you love the most about, you know, changing their perception of what your life's all about?
Have a look around afterwards. Thank you for sharing. And I think I just want to say I'm sorry you had that experience. I know I've had similar, as coming out as queer, coming out as trans. And I think what it comes down to as well is that is what I see, like when I work with people in community. I think that is the problem at the base of it, is that there's these expectations that family, that parents, that the world has on us, on the individual. That's what we have to break down. First of all, like on a systematic level, these expectations that people put on the individual, that, you know, the idea that you're going to be born in a binary, you know, male or female, that you're going to grow up and you're going to be binary, like cishet, that you're going to be neurotypical, that you're going to be able-bodied, that you're going to have, you know, you're going to have a normal job, whatever that looks like, that aligns with what your family is expecting of you. Like all of that, right to the base of a baby being born and us assigning them a gender. That's where we need to start with. Like, we can't have these expectations because the individual is the individual and they're going to do whatever they're going to do. We need to talk about that as a community, as a society, as support people. We need to start breaking down those ideas and expectations and stereotypes of what a life is going to look like, because we just, that's not what it's going to look like for everyone, for many people. Yeah.
So I think what I want to say is that other people, so your family's expectations about who you're going to be and what your life, how your life is going to turn out, that is absolutely tied up in meaning and identity making for them and for you. And it is very deeply painful to have all of that challenged, and the grief that a family member might feel at those unrealized expectations or that sudden kind of turn that they weren't expecting is completely valid. Where I think I struggle is the idea that managing that grief and making the other person feel better for their grief is my responsibility as the person who has identified as being a member of a marginalized group, whether or not I had any sort of choice in the matter, or whether, you know, it sort of was sprung upon me. And I'm also managing potentially grief and rage and all of those very, very difficult feelings. So it's a complicated relationship to navigate, because also as a child, a young person on that side of the family dynamic, you sort of want to take responsibility for your parents' feelings. But it does have to work both ways. They also have to take responsibility for the fact that this is you, this is your life. And also, again, you may not be entirely responsible for their feelings and how they manage them.
I'm just really sad to hear your story. I just think that's disappointing, but I suppose what I feel is that, well, I hope I'm right, that things are different, that it's more acceptable. I can remember, 100 years ago being a member of the South Australian Police, and their answer to gay men was to throw them in the River Torrens. And I think terrible things have happened. I just hope it's better. I do think there's got to be that education, that there is more of an acceptance. Or is that just me being a bit of a Pollyanna? I just think if we can educate people to accept that we're all different. We've all got odd personalities and quirks, and we're all different, but that's what makes the world go round. It's what makes it an exciting place to be in. And yes, I must admit a sadness for the loss of my son's opportunities, but I'm sad for him. I'm probably a bit sad for me as well, but only because I can see the awful effect this is having on his life. And that breaks my heart and his family's. But no, I would not say it's not his fault. It's never his fault. He didn't ask for this issue to arise. And but yeah, we accept it. It was hard at first. And that was that lack of understanding. We didn't have a clue. And as carers, we were not allowed to know. We weren't allowed to know the diagnosis. We weren't allowed to know he was 20 and the prognosis. So carers were left completely out of the picture. We didn't know what the effect of the treatments would be, and it's been a real battle. I don't want to know the personal stories that my son shares with his treatment team, but I needed to know how to care for him, what would help him, how do we support this person who's struggling with a terrible illness that he couldn't understand either. And so I think we're better now. I hope we're better now. Anyway.
So I've been working with young people for 6 years now, and I actually am optimistic, because I actually think that the world is getting more accepting of diversity and embracing diversity. And so I think it is a matter of working through the system, and older people will no longer be the sort of the dominant narrative and dominant force in determining what's going on in society. And yeah, I think so. Is there another? Oh. Sharon, you wanted to say something?
Oh, just to add, I alluded to in my intro about how do we get past this issue of getting stuck. And the getting stuck is when we have these set stereotypes and set expectations, and life's just not like that, as you've heard from the panel. So how do we get past getting locked into these things, and then when they're challenged, when those structures of expectations and stereotypes that we've made our sort of mantra get challenged, it's about getting rid of those stereotypes and expectations and actually embracing lifelong learning, isn't it? To be open to diversity as just part of change and life. But yeah, we seem to love these structures that we create culturally and socially, and then we get challenged. And then the stigmatising, discriminatory views come out when we can't make sense of our stuck expectations and stereotypes. There's something really fundamental there. That's my bit.
Thank you. Is there another question from inside, or does Kathy have one from online? Rose, go.
Yeah, I've suffered serious stigmatisation in my family where I can't actually have anything to do with my siblings or their families because it's gone down to the next generation. And so when the next generation began to discriminate and stigmatise me and my severely disabled son and my daughter, it was time to have safe boundaries for us. I was put down on my life by my dad. Always told I was bloody hopeless my whole life because I was different. So my question, and I'd like to come on team and ask your opinions, especially yours. What can we do to break down the stigmatisation in those areas of families that just can be so detrimental to your whole life?
It's a really good question and a really tough question to answer as well. And I'm going to come from a multicultural perspective on this one. Conversations and forums like this is a really good way to start. And, you know, this is really great. We've got community sector workers here, but now we need to bring it into communities and actually have community members there and listening to people's stories and listening to people's questions and having a bit more understanding and openness about these conversations. Because if we don't talk about it, then how do we make change? We have to talk about it to bring that around. And so, you know, from a multicultural perspective, because I'm going to come from it that way a little bit, is we need community leaders to come in because they're the go-to people in communities. They are the hierarchy. They're the people that are listened to. Religious leaders, they are listened to. They're the ones that influence what people think and within their communities and how they respond as well. And so if they are at the table having these conversations and then taking it back to their communities and sharing that with them, then we start having some change, because that filters through to families and people start thinking a little bit differently. Until that happens, I think we're going to be stuck, because no matter how much, and I've been in the community sector a long time, worked mostly with young people and seen a lot of different things, and no matter how much work we do as community workers, unless we get that buy-in from families and from communities, then we're really kind of just making very base level differences. So we need that buy-in from community members and community leaders. So, you know, having forums and events where they come and they sit and they listen and they take that back, I think is really essential and key to then see some changes.
Unfortunately, some are totally closed to that too.
Look, absolutely. And I mean, in a really ideal world, I'd say, yes, we're going to see it. But I think similar to conversations we have about racism, like I think we're really sticking our expectations and we try and make changes where we can, knowing that unfortunately we're probably not going to make a change everywhere. And so where we can, we'll try.
Yeah, absolutely. I can always add something. No, I absolutely agree. And I think it's very similar for mob. You know, we are community is family, you know, my aunties, my uncles, because they're not, might not be related to me, but that doesn't make them any less of like a relationship to me and my family. And I do think it's absolutely that education. Like I've had like people I don't even know, like mob from like across the country contact me because they hear that I'm queer and I'm black fella, and they have a queer child and they don't understand it, and then they, you know, want to have a yarn. So I think it's really, it's on the people, like the time and energy that advocates and activists and support workers put in really do make a difference. I think sometimes, like we're saying, sometimes we just can't change people. And I think when that's the case, it's okay, how do we make other safe spaces and other community for our, you know, for these folk? You know, that's when we, you know, go to community centers and we make community groups, and we find found family. Even if our family won't accept us, they don't want to learn, that's when we have to look at, you know, elsewhere. We look at people who do love us and care for us and are educated or happy and excited to be educated. Have either of you?
There's a song, Lady in White, but yes.
Just further to your point now around that education and educating communities, I guess both of you, how do you manage, I guess, taking on that burden when you're already the marginalized person a lot of the time?
And I think-
or how do you find that experience, and how do you, I guess, mobilize people to come along on that journey with you?
I'm wondering if Terry might start, because yeah, it's a very similar path and trajectory and struggle with all.
Now, one of the things that I often say now when I'm talking about people who want to become lived experience storytellers is be sure to remember that you don't actually owe anyone your story. Because there is a great deal of emotional labor involved in becoming a person who gets involved in that work and is out there saying, all right, I'm actually going to push for change, even within my own family. So when it comes to those very close relationships, it's one of those things where sometimes change doesn't happen, sometimes change takes a great deal of time, but you have the right to say, I do not have time to wait for you to come this far. Once you enter into an advocacy space where you're sharing stories and saying, look, we actually want to change people's minds, you do then have to kind of deal with the burden of time and the burden of the just an incredible sort of weight of sharing these stories and getting people's reactions and trying to see that sort of shift. And it's not something that everyone wants to do. And it's absolutely not something that everyone has to do. So you're not even by law required to disclose these sorts of experiences in pretty much any context. And so it takes, I think, some time to actually get to the point where you are sure that it is something you want to take on. Because if you go into it and say, I'm going to be the poster child for mental health recovery and I'm going to change everyone's minds, not knowing how bloody hard it is, then you're going to have a really, really difficult time, and it can actually be profoundly harmful and damaging. So I think there is a point where you have to be at where you either can say, I actually, I can take the damage, or you know what, it's worth it. And that's a very personal decision that I think people have to come to with time and a great deal of thought about themselves and where they are and what really matters to them.
Yeah.
Forever. Yes, yes, of course, because the disclosure horse has very definitely sailed in my case. So this is me forever, my life. And I'm now, I think I almost let that horse sail before I realized that this would be the forever thing. And you can Google Terry Warner mental health and get a great deal of interesting information about me. So yeah, absolutely. That is an excellent point, that yes, it is forever once you've taken that step.
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts. We can always have a yarn about it, but I think the big thing is, yeah, it's not. I also, okay, pay the rent on stolen land. I like getting paid. That really makes a difference. It takes a lot of time and energy, and I think it shows a level of respect when I am offered a commission for and I do a lot of kind of talking for commission and stuff. But to do it, I think you need a support system. I have self-care. I have my boundaries. There are things I won't do. There are things I will do. It always depends on who else is speaking, who else is part of it. Like if it's just a whole group of white cishet fellas who want to go have a chat, I might say no. But when it's, it's done by community, for community, like not with us, without us, right? Like bring us along for the ride, have us there. That's what's important. Peer supervision is great. Support networks are great. Like networks what this is how we support each other. We should all be in this together, have each other's backs. It's family, right?
Look, totally similar. In my work role, I attend almost every community event across a diverse range of communities. In fact, I don't have a weekend, and as someone told me the other day, I don't have a life anymore either, because I just go to a lot of community events. But it's actually really important for me because I build relationships with people then, and those relationships are what helps me to then sit down and have conversations with parents, with community leaders, with people within communities. I go to a lot of speaking events, and now I find a lot of community leaders are attending those, which is really good. And they come to me afterwards and they say, can you come to our event and just have a chat to people? And I do that. Racism and cultural identities within young people is probably the highest percentage of mental health work that we do. And so I go into a lot of schools and have conversations. And so I'm really passionate about it. So I think that helps because I understand a lot of the experiences that people have, and that really drives me to want to change. But exactly what Alistair said, like, you have to have a safe space. So I find racism really triggering, and I have to really take moments for myself, but I'm really open and upfront about it. And I say, if I get up for a moment and walk away, I just need a little bit of time and I'll come back to you. But I have to take those times for myself. And I find that actually really helps because it shows the young people vulnerability. It actually shows them this kinship with their experiences. And that's really important because it then allows safe spaces for people to have conversations, but it also sets some boundaries for them and for me, for them to understand what my limitations are. But I have really great relationships with community leaders. They come and we'll have conversations now and say, I don't think I'm the safe person to talk to this family or this person with what they're experiencing, but can you come and have a conversation with them? So I think that's been a really big part of, it's a really big job. It's taken a couple of years to get to this point, I think, but it's been worth it because we are seeing changes now, and we're seeing changes in community members being really upfront. Like, I've had parents who've come and sat down with me really tearful and said, I don't know what to do, but I can see something happening, and what do I do? And it's like, this is what we want. We want parents to actually come and have those conversations with us, and then create spaces where we can go and have a chat with their young people or their kids. I think someone had a question, at the back. I'll hold on to it if you want, and I'll pass it along.
Thanks everyone for your insights. A lot of you are doing great work in reducing stigma, and talked about perhaps that overall levels of stigma are reducing. I'm interested about that trend and its interplay with self-stigma and how much self-stigma is able to keep up and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
We're calling in an academic. Sharon, what did you hear that question?
If you can repeat it, you had a very soft voice.
Sure. It's just about what sort of trends are there in terms of stigma, and how is self-stigma? Is it keeping track? Is self-stigma getting better or worse? Do you have any research or knowledge around that?
I don't have a sense of the research, but I think the concept itself has to be fundamentally challenged. I think it's a convenient term, self-stigma, and I'm not sure that it accurately reflects the person's experience. In fact, in an unintentional way, it almost reinforces stigma for me, because it's somehow putting it back on the person when actually they've experienced real, often repeated grinding consequences of daily life, experiencing stigma and discrimination. And I'm not sure that, self-stigma, labelling it as a consequence of that seems to be very unfair somehow to me. No, I'm not up on specific research. I would hope that it's lessened because we're more open as a society to diversity. But always when you get greater diversity, you also get reactionary processes that happen as well. But if you look at it differently, that means you're getting somewhere. If you're experiencing the reactionary elements that come through in a society, then absolutely history and research tells you you're relevant. you're making some impact, because otherwise they wouldn't bother reacting to you, if that makes sense. So
Thank you.
those ideas to the audience and the other panel members.
Thank you. I guess I'm going to add to some controversy here. So I'm going to disagree with you on one level in terms of I think the biggest barrier for me in getting better was this perception, you know, and what is called self-stigma and discriminating against myself and what my future held based upon a diagnosis of bipolar disorder. So I had sort of 3 generations in on my father's side. So I had a long view of what that might mean. And I actually embraced that, incorporated that, and I believed it. And it was only really getting involved with MHCC when I came here. I left Canada to avoid my infamy over there. And I got involved with MHCC and I started using my story in a way that was trying to help young people. But in the process, I met so many people with mental health issues that I came to know and respect, that I started thinking, hey, these guys are okay. And in that process, if these guys are okay with mental health issues, then I might be okay too. So I sort of see that, you know, that research done by Patrick Corrigan so much around stigma, I do actually embrace that aspect of the problem with, you know, social stigma is it's such a long, hard road, and it's one that we have to fight. But with internalized stigma, you can make changes so rapidly that you can then become an agent of change if you see that from the other side. So I sort of see it from a different perspective. I don't like the idea of blaming.
I'm not disagreeing with you. It's more that as soon as you give something a label, then it's what other people then do with it. They then position it to, oh, that person is self-stigmatizing. There's something that needs to be done to fix them. Some intervention to help them with their self-stigmatizing view. It can get a bit distorted, and it's not helpful to the person. It puts the blame on the person to fix it for some of those.
I'm going to let you have the last word.
It's too convenient. Yeah.
Further, because I'm just the host here. So, is there another question from the floor, perhaps?
Can I just say, I just wanted to comment on something that you were saying there, Sharon, and maybe just to unpack it a bit in the, so at the beginning when I was talking about that national survey, and I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, Sharon, but this is where maybe I could see the self-stigma being used in a way that was maybe different to what you're referring to, Keith, but maybe is part of the problem. So it was talking about people, for example, not engaging in relationships and not certain behaviours, which was about self-stigma. And I think maybe there's a bit of an issue there, because it's not necessarily that someone has internalized the negative concept of mental illness there. I think it's actually because they're fearing, or there might be a perception or a concern about how others are going to treat them, which is a different thing. So I think sometimes maybe some of that issue around self-stigma, and again, I don't know, I'm just, this is my reading just of that sort of skim reading of that, the draft strategy, sorry, it's a draft strategy, is that it was kind of conflating different things, which so I think that's different about someone say, I've internalized the negative notions around mental illness, is different to say, I'm not engaging in those behaviours because of the reactions I'm anticipating potentially from others. Do you get what I mean? I think
guilty on both charges, though. I think the two are related and they overlap, but my lived experience is very much that was a barrier. I don't want to monopolize this whole, but I'm actually, it was a part of an employment at the House of Reps did this research into employment, and I'm on record saying that, you know, I basically think self-stigma almost ended my life. So I see it from a different way, but that's okay. That's why there are a whole different, you know, range of views, and none of them are mutually exclusive.
You give a system the opportunity to add more pathologizing, and it will. What we need to do is actually, you know, foster people's capacity and strengths, and you know, people have got to be comfortable growing their feathers, and it's okay. You know, we all have to grow our feathers.
even if we're losing hair. Are there any other questions from the audience? I'm wondering about one question about what role does the media play in reinforcing, perpetuating stigma and discrimination? What role could it play in challenging stigma and bring about social change? And so, Judy, you've been involved for many years.
I have many, too many, but I'm not going to work away from it either. And I think the media has had good and bad effects. I think one of the things that has been good, a lot of very well-known people coming out and admitting to their mental illness or their gayness or their whatever. So that if it's acceptable for somebody who you see on stage and screen, that becomes much more acceptable for you. My son, it's only in the last few years, has admitted he's got a mental illness. It's something he didn't want to talk about, and that was okay. It's his choice. So yes, self-stigma, whether he's better for admitting it, I don't know. But I also think the media has been bad. I think a lot of things that really make me very angry at the moment is the reporting of incidences with people sort of saying it was their mental illness and almost trivializing. My son's got schizophrenia. It's a really difficult, and he has psychotic episodes. It's been really tough, but you get people who come in because it will get them off the charge. And to me, that makes me very angry when I think that they're almost using mental illness as their excuse, rather than the recognition that, yes, there are some cases it is a reason, not an excuse, but it's a reason. Does that answer anything?
So the media has this fantastic power to take a series of objective facts and then craft a really harmful and false narrative out of them. So you can take a series of pieces of information, you know, a person allegedly committed a crime, that person has a history of mental health conditions, and then they can draw a conclusion where those two things, yes, exist in the same person, but are not necessarily related. So the media can do a great deal of harm, but they do have opportunities. And now a couple of years ago, I don't know if you remember the show Wakefield, which I spent a lot of time going, I'm not sure if I should watch this. Maybe I should watch this so that other people don't have to, because those sorts of narratives, particularly about people who find themselves in mental health, like inpatient mental health units, they can be deeply problematic and harmful. And just, I can sit there going, I'm going to smash my TV screen because I'm so angry about the way these people are being portrayed. But there's this one particular little scene, which is about a patient who assaults a nurse. And when you've been in public mental health units, you know that the narrative, the clinical narrative and the narrative that persists is always going to be patient who is known to be aggressive became assaultive over a jigsaw puzzle. But the way that that interaction was told, with nuance and with the very sort of complicated relationship between staff and between patients and what actually matters to patients and why it is that they might eventually come to a point where they go, look, I cannot deal with the way I'm being treated. I thought if we could tell more of those stories, if we could say, here is the patient perspective on what the clinical team will always say is occupational violence caused by an assaultive patient. If we could have more of those stories, then we might actually see some change, because people would go, maybe there is more than one way of representing this interaction. Maybe the person with the mental health condition is actually not the culprit. Maybe they were subject to conditions and experiences that just put them at a point where anyone would suddenly be like, look, I'm actually really angry about the way I've just been treated. So there is that power, but those stories tend to get suppressed because it is always easier to tell the narrative that is the sensational one that says, oh, we know who the person is who did the wrong thing. You know, so there is power, and I think there is a lot of blame that we can place on the media for the way that people who experience mental health conditions are perceived. But it would be so great if we could actually harness that power for good instead of what it's ordinarily used for.
Do you want me to jump in? Yeah, great comments, Terry. There is research around particularly the inpatient environments, and there's a model called safe wards, which really looks at those micro behaviours and the interactions, because you're right, it starts way back, and it doesn't just include what the person has done. It's the whole environment, it's the geography of an environment. That's why all of the barrier windows came down in Centrelink years ago, because they understood the evidence was that it actually reduced frustration and angst. It's about the structures that people have to work within, as much as their interactions with each other. So it's the whole of the context, as Terry has said, that has to be taken into account. It's just a cop-out and too easy to say it's the person, they have the problem, they have a mental illness, etc.
I have two vaguely connected thoughts on this. You can figure out how they're connected later. The first one is, for a very long time, there's this thing called bury your gaze. For a very long time, as queer, as trans people, the only representation we got in media, in literature, in the news was if we were dead, if we were dying, if we were attacked, or if we were doing something wrong. If we were sex workers, if we were arrested, if we were, committing a crime, and somehow it came back to us being queer or trans. And that has had serious detrimental results even to today. And I like to think that, we have progressed and things have changed. Things are still really shit for a lot of people in a lot of ways. We still see it recently as well with the new bills, like the religious discrimination bill that happened, the sports bill that happened, with the plebiscite, and we saw in community the rates of mental health absolutely skyrocket during those debates, because we were vilified and we were the perpetrators in the media, and we were absolutely thrown across the rocks. And these are some of the most vulnerable communities, right? Being vilified and victimized in the media. So it's an absolutely powerful thing, and I hope it can be used for good. And we are seeing better representation in TV shows and movies. We're seeing role models come out, but there's a lot to go, is what I'll say.
I think you've just.
So Heather Stewart is a professor in Canada who has focused on the role of media and stigma, and her research basically encapsulates what you said. It can be used for good, but historically, and the majority is still relying upon stereotypes to tell stories in very fast ways, and those stereotypes are negative and damaging. So Heather Stewart, someone to read if you're interested in stigma and the media. Now, Ben, what does your clock say? What do your arms say? We have 4 minutes. Does everyone want to just give? Does anyone have something that they just want to add? Sharon, any summary or last comment?
I just, this challenge, particularly with media, there are so many images where, if you're famous and, you demonstrate diversity, difference, culturally, there's something about that we accept. But if you're just an ordinary, everyday person, somehow it's different. There are a number of things that are fascinating. There seems to be one rule for one thing and not consistency in how we, as a society, even tackle stigma and discrimination. We revere, for example, Aboriginal actors, but do we translate that to everyday life with people in the community who identify with Aboriginal culture? And there's these double standards that keep coming up all the time related to stigma and discrimination somehow. how do we, the challenges, why do we keep doing that? How do we get past these things?
Thank you. Thank you. Does anyone have any closing?
I suppose I just think how far we've come when we set up the Mental Health Community Coalition. And I can remember the first meeting going along and thinking, this is fantastic. And being told by one of the consumers that, well, we think you're all the problem anyway as a carer. But I think how brilliantly we have worked together, and we just have to continue. We are all sort of such a diverse group. And if we can just get out there and tell people, look, we're normal. My son is normal. He's just got a mental illness. We all work together, and we've come, Pam would agree, from those early days, we've come a huge distance, haven't we? But we've got a long way to go, and we will get there. Don't you reckon?
I am a well-known cynic, and I vary between being the sort of, I vary from the cynic who's willing to sort of embrace the absurdity of life to being the very, very angry cynic. So I'm not actually sure that we're reducing stigma. I think that it is changing. I think that when broad sort of public attitudes towards people who are different or seen as other start to change for the better, we get the more insidious, really harmful, sort of under the table, behind the door sorts of stigma. So we get those societal attitudes playing out in ways that are justified in the workplace. We get those attitudes playing out in the way that people with mental health challenges are often denied medical care. I had a psychiatrist once who bless him, said some really fantastic things and some really fantastically obtuse things. But one of the things he once said to me was, Terry, if you want to see some really, really complex medical cases, become a psychiatrist. Because often what will happen is people who have complex needs will find themselves in psychiatry, whereas people who have psychiatric diagnoses will find themselves ignored by the other medical specialties because, it must all be in their minds, because psychiatric diagnoses and mental health conditions tend to stick as convenient explanatory models for behavior, for symptoms, for all kinds of things. So when we say stigma is reducing, I think that we dodge a much larger conversation about how these things then play out systemically in ways that are harder to pinpoint and much, much harder to confront.
Thank you. I think I'm angry about something. I'm really angry the other day when I was cold calling doctors looking for someone to take on a patient who was trans and intersex, who just needed someone to help him out for a mental health condition. And we could not find anyone because every single doctor and medical practice we called said they will not see trans people. They can't. They're not qualified. It's too hard. It's too scary. They don't know anything about trans people. They can't see us. And so that person, like many other people currently in the ACT, will not see anyone and will go unhelped and unsupported. I think it's really important when we talk about stigma to talk about the entire person. I feel like as a queer, trans, black fella, that when I go to places, I have to be just a trans person or I have to be just an Aboriginal person. I can't be my entire self because we, as support systems, we're still not supporting the entire person. We're supporting the one single identity. I think that's something we all need to, as consumers, as carers, as support workers, as individuals, as community members. I think it's always really important to go back to how we can support the entire person.
Thank you. And I'm just going to be really short and just say, keep having those conversations with people, keep calling it out when you see language that's being used that's not appropriate and not really addressing, and think about simple language when you're talking to different groups of people and how you can explain it to them that it's understandable so that people actually do get the help that they need or are comfortable to start talking about the help that they need. But keep having conversations and keep attending forums like this and events like this, and bring anyone and everyone that you can think of along with you, because it needs to be a shared collective of people having those conversations and listening to other people's stories.
You just give the panelists a big hand. That would be great.
And can we also give Keith a big hand too? Thank you, Keith, for being such a fantastic facilitator. So we're just approaching the end of the, I think I'll just hold this. I think it's probably easier. The end of the formal component of this event. However, just before we get to some celebrations and afternoon tea, I just wanted to make you aware of a few events that we have happening with MHCC ACT. So, well, actually, firstly, before we get to the events, I want to highlight our workforce survey. So if there is anyone here who is in the community managed mental health sector and you haven't done our survey yet on the mental health workforce, please do so. This is a really important survey. We just don't have the data on our workforce in the ACT, and we really need that so that we can better understand what the issues are, but also do advocacy and support the development of the ACT's mental health workforce strategy, and make sure the issues of our sector are actually addressed. You have your hand up, I noticed, John. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to say I have some paper form versions of the survey if anyone wants to do it sort of this afternoon. No worries.
Yep. And of course, we also have our monthly training workshops. So the first two workshops for 2023 will be our ever popular introduction to peer work, and also a course that we're doing with a TODA on alcohol and other drugs. And so please keep an eye on our social media and in our newsletter for when we launch registrations for these courses. And we'll also be announcing soon new dates. So for next year for our Walk on Country training, which has proved very popular and which is free to staff members of MHCC ACT member organisations. So just to say just a few final words and wrap up, I just want to hand over to our President, Yvonne Luxford. Yvonne, yep, thank you. Hasn't you been sitting for so long? That's right. Thanks, Yvonne.
Thanks, Corinne. I'm sorry I'm standing between everybody and the celebrations, but I'd just like to start, even though I'm speaking at the end, can I first of all acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that we're meeting on today, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, and thank them for taking such incredible care of this land over so many centuries. And I'd also just like to follow on from that. I'm particularly I'm conscious of what Alistair was just saying about the mental ill health that was caused by the plebiscite, and we can predict there will be similar outcomes in the upcoming referendum. So I'd just like to mention to everyone, if you don't know already, that MHCC ACT has fully endorsed the Uluru Statement from the Heart, fully supportive of the referendum, and we encourage all of you to do the same and to help protect people through this time. Get on to this afternoon. Wow, what a panel. I didn't want that to end. I'm sure you all feel the same way. My brain is just going a million miles an hour. I'm thinking of all this. I had a million questions to ask, but I kept my mouth shut because I knew I got to speak now anyway. But it was just wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you for being so generous with your time, your stories, your thoughts, and Sharon, also the things that you challenged us with. And there were wonderful challenges, as most of us as service providers in the room, challenges to us as service providers, challenges to us also simply as members of our society and as our community of how we consider things. There were a couple of points there that, Terry, you said something that just, it's going to stay with me for a very long time. That whole concept of expecting people to change, to comply with what society considers is
normal behavior, as opposed to us actually being more accepting of every point of diversity. So you know, these aren't new things, but they're amazing things to be shared with us this afternoon. And thank you again for your time, and again, as I say, your generosity. I'm not going to keep chatting, but I do have a little gift for everybody, and I'll just have to hold yours up and wave. Sorry, Sharon, but I just want to. I'm going to have to put this down and come and say thank you to you all and hand over gifts. But thank you, and can you everybody join me again in thanking an amazing panel, and thank you very much.